I work on radio, although actually when I was in graduate school, one of my advisors said, Andrew, you can't keep working on radio because then you're going to be crazy radio lady for decades to come. So I've been trying to branch out. And I would also like to, I guess, begin by just joining everyone who's spoken thus far to say this has been a really terrific conference. It's been such a pleasure, and it has been a really prodigious effort to put together. So it's been really such a treat to be here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the papers today and the workshop tomorrow. So we've been asked in this conference to think about three elements, right? The Arab world, transformations in it, and about how to think of this process conceptually or theoretically. And for me, this has been an opportunity to start working through something that continually bugs me, and also to focus on an area that interests me. So basically, this is kind of intellectual therapy. So we'll see how this goes. And so let me start with what has been bugging me, which I think is the well-known trope idea that in the Levant, the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems you can come up with from a laundry list, is that the states that we have are the product of a British-French détente, right, largely modeled on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and that the Achilles heel of these states is that their borders are artificial, right? They pay no attention to ethnic divisions, religious divisions, communal identity, so have no organic rationale. And unlike in Europe, they also haven't been produced as authentic through centuries of state warfare and negotiation. And I would say, yep, that's right, those points are totally correct. And journalists and scholars have discovered and rediscovered the artificial borders argument many times. So I just put up one recent example. This is from the Wall Street Journal in April on the journalistic side, describing post-Ottoman states as often artificial creations, sometimes with implausibly straight lines for borders. I would also note that there was an Atlantic article, not the famous Atlantic article, another Atlantic article later that summer that said, yes, well, Kansas and Nebraska also have fairly artificial borders and they seem to be fine. But then also, on the scholarship side, we have more classic works like Ayyubi's Overstating the Arab State, which I think for a certain generation of people in graduate school was required reading, and who argues that Arab world state formation, and he says, was not the outcome of an integrative social process emanating from within, but was largely the result of disintegrative political processes imposed from without, right? And he uses that to argue that minorities, rather than post or late Ottoman Sunni Arab elites, were better able to capitalize on the new realities that these new opportunities that these borders created. And just in case you're wondering, as I was, which state counts as most artificial, or which gets the most artificial award, he says that, and I'm going to quote again, nowhere was this artificiality of entities more obvious than in the case of Transjordan, a corridor country without a distinct history or focal point or even a native royal family. Actually, he thinks that Lebanon, by contrast, is much less artificial geographically and compositionally. So that's something interesting to think about. These borders certainly are inorganic. And they certainly are or were imposed by European powers who are focused on colonial governance and strategic interests. I think what I find myself wondering when the artificial borders argument is held up as an explanatory paradigm is, why is this artificiality only threatening these states now, after nearly a century? And I think of that also, I think, because my house was built in 1920, so my house seems to be holding up fine, although it's also getting a little cracked around the edges. So it's either at nearly a century or after half a century, if you want to back the timeline up to, say, include Black September and the Lebanon Civil War. So that's kind of the first question, and then can we break this down internally to understand why some states have proven more or less artificial than others. So instead of focusing on the question of artificial borders, which I consider becoming a bit of a dead end, which I can come back to, I'd like to look at the Levant in terms of sovereignty, to see how shifting the lens might help us better understand the kinds of transformations that are happening or not happening in the states of the Levant. So sovereignty in state terms, I think, is very, very basically understood as self-governance, right? The kind of classic monopoly of power or authority over a territory without external control or influence being exerted over it. Absolute supremacy over its internal and external affairs. So basically autonomy with respect to internal decision-making and independence from interference or influence in external decision making. And what I want to do is break that general definition down a bit, or at least open up the recognition that state sovereignty is not an all or nothing concept, which I think is not new. But I'm looking at it particularly in light of Elizabeth Cohen's work on understanding citizenship as dispersed in degrees to different categories of people, right? So that also, rather than an all or nothing category, one can de facto and de jure have partial or semi-citizenship. So in an American context, right, we can talk about African Americans as having de facto a kind of lesser degree of citizenship. And in terms of de jure semi-citizenship, we can talk about naturalized citizens not being able to run for president, and also children, right, who are citizens and yet not full citizens. So this isn't a particularly malign way of breaking down citizenship, but it's a more useful one than considering it an all or nothing category. And for those of us who work on media, and particularly print media, I think this also resonates with ideas about breaking down literacy, so that literacy also is not seen as all or nothing. So that's what I want to look at. I would say, put this up, this is where I note critiques of that approach. So not everyone likes the idea of breaking down sovereignty or considering it an internally heterogeneous concept. This is actually a very well-known scholar of law at LSE who sees the proliferation of what he terms adjectival add-ons to the notion of sovereignty as a sign of not understanding what sovereignty is. And so we have a bunch of ways to think of it: shared, mixed, divided, pooled, cooperative, floating, multiple, perforated, fragmented, reconfigured, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I like perforated, so that's the term I'm going to use. And I do think it's useful, but I'm noting that not everyone does. So I'm thinking about the concept of perforated sovereignty, which has actually been used, I think, primarily in two ways. One is to look at the EU and to describe the European Union as a set of sovereignties in which member states have divided their sovereignty or pooled their sovereignty, there are a lot of adjectives here also, or transferred it to the larger union. And this isn't my project, but I actually think that might be quite interesting. We have a Model Arab League chapter being started at my university, and my students came up to me and said that. I was like, really? Why on earth would you want to replicate the Arab League? Like, at least the UN has like some action behind it. Why? What are you guys going to do? Sit around and imitate Gaddafi in 2005? But I think if we do want to think about this notion of pooling sovereignties, perforated international organization sovereignties, then that might actually be an interesting way to think about Arab nationalism in a non-laughable way, which I think would be useful. If it's used positively for the EU, why is it not used positively to talk about Arab efforts? In any case, in Chinese studies, the term has also been used particularly to talk about provincial governments' impact on perforating the sovereignty of the one-party state, particularly when it comes to international trade. So this is actually a term that I'm not making up and has been used positively in one context and I guess neutrally analytically in another. In the case of the Levant, what I'd actually like to suggest is that we see state sovereignty as perforated by non-state actors. And here particularly I'm thinking about international NGOs. I think we can certainly also talk about the perforation of state sovereignty by regional powers and by international powers looking to influence domestic policy, but I think that's fairly well known. It already has a very substantial body of literature, scholarly and popular. So I want to here just take a look at one of the more, I think, extreme examples, Lebanon, right? So this is just a listing of the offices, of the UN-affiliated offices in Lebanon. So these are ones that are located in Lebanon and working on Lebanon, which is a little bit different than having the UN headquartered in New York. Although I was thinking about this morning and thinking, well, actually you could make an argument that having the United Nations headquarters in New York is part of what makes New York a weird city compared to the rest of the United States. But anyways, so this is the listing. I don't think it's unfamiliar to anyone who spent time in Lebanon, and I think it also is articulated differently in the sense of if you are ever trying to go to a United Nations office, you better be very careful in specifying to your taxi driver in Beirut which one you want to go to, or you will be taken to one and then the next and then the third because there are so many. So this is the more kind of formalized presentation of that experience. And we can do something similar for Jordan, and we could do something similar similar for Syria before 2011, 2012, right? So why does this matter? For me, I think it matters because these groups are largely autonomous, right? They operate under the aegis of state permission, but they operate largely autonomously, and they're also financially autonomous. And I think the money issue is also something to think about when we think about issues of effective sovereignty, right? Which states are economically supreme, relying on tax revenue or other domestic funding, and which states are aid dependent or receive money indirectly through the work of NGOs operating in their territory. And I'd also say, we also need to think here about the role of capital cities. And here, Masna Plato's question yesterday about thinking about where schools are located in Palestinian camps, I think was quite interesting. And I think we might ask the same question concerning NGOs, which generally cluster in capital cities. What effects is populating the capital with autonomous organizations operating independently of the national government have, particularly in small states in which the capital city plays a disproportionately large role? And then by contrast, what does operating at the border, like UNIFIL does, what effects does that have? So I'm not really ready to make this argument, but in terms of state durability, I am beginning to wonder whether political sovereignty and economic weakness might be linked when it comes to the potential for state transformation. I don't think this is necessarily right, but I think there's an argument to be made that weak states might be a little bit more durable. So that's something I'm thinking about. I want to turn now to look very, very briefly at the language used in Levantine constitutions. I'm interested in constitutions, Nermeen has heard me pontificate about this before, right? Not as statements of reality on the ground, but I'm really interested in them as aspirational statements, right? That they hope that they reflect the hopes of their framers. They're not representative, right? They're not representative of general popular expressions, but they represent or they reflect the hopes of their framers. And I think they also reflect a lot of the anxieties operating at the time, right? So when we look at the constitutions of Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, as well as the 2000 document for Palestine, in terms of sovereignty, what do we see, right? We see a lot about the concerns of the post-mandate context. For example, Lebanon actually spells out its territorial boundaries in the constitution. Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon all emphasize that their states are indivisible. No part can leave the state, no part of it can be removed. We also see some interesting differences. I think Jordan doesn't define the locus of sovereignty, whereas Lebanon and Syria, which is from 1973, so a little bit later, do. This also ended up being a little bit disheartening. Here's an argument that I absolutely don't want to make, which is about transformation in states that don't include Sharia in their constitution. So I'd love to be corrected here. Jordan mentioned Sharia courts in the context of talking about different kinds of courts that will operate in the country, but it doesn't say anything about Sharia as a source of legislation for the country as a whole. Lebanon, of course, says nothing about Sharia. And Syria, I must say, is one of the few, if not the only ones that I can think of that talks about fiqh rather than Sharia. So as someone who spends an awful lot of time trying to teach my students that there is a difference between fiqh and Sharia, I'm really pleased that the Ba'athist got that right. I can't say much more about the Syrian constitution that I love, but I think that's interesting. I suspect there's something more to think about that there. Palestine's document, of course, is much more recent, and it distinguishes between Islamic Sharia as a source for legislation and then the various Sharias being used for basically personal status issues for each religious community. So the argument I want to make is not that if you don't put Sharia in your constitution, you are a more durable state. That is not the argument I want to make. In fact, this makes me a little bit uncomfortable to have noticed this, but I do want to make the argument that we need to look more closely at founding documents and take them seriously when thinking about what sovereignty looks like from country to country in terms of how it was laid out from the beginning. What is its locus? What anxieties or concerns are expressed in how sovereignty is spelled out? And what role marquee issues like religion play in this process? So I want to turn very briefly before closing to consider another transformation in the Arab world, which is the transformation of extremism. I actually think it's analytically quite interesting, particularly in terms of state building, and because I think it also helps point to extremism as an internally diverse category, another argument that I often fail to make successfully with students. So obviously I don't have a constitution to point to here, But I put up a few key phrases from the June 2014 announcement of being a caliphate. And I think, just to kind of highlight this point, we know that extremists are not all created equal, right? Some of them don't recognize the nation-state system because they're trying to bring up about the end of the world, so they're not interested in state building at all. And that's not ISIS, right? ISIS has created a state, is interested in this world achievement, this world performance, if you want to think of it in those terms. But it's not clear that it recognizes the nation-state system, right? So if we think back to kind of the UN Charter, the UN has a real strong emphasis on sovereignty, right? It treats, if you are a sovereign state, you are treated as a legitimate state, and your borders are impermeable, right? The borders are sacrosanct. And for many religious people, including Islamists, right, the only sovereign power in the world is God's, right? God is the locus of sovereignty. That's largely a theoretical distinction for most groups, I think as far as we can tell, like the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. But for groups like ISIS, who are engaged in state building, that matters, right? They see their state as fulfilling some kind of divine mandate, both authorized and required by God. They don't see themselves, as far as we can tell, as part of a concert of nations in the same way, but as having God on their side and wrong on everyone else's. And I think that is the part that is expressed in that they are the Islamic State, not an Islamic State. And so I think if we think today about arguments regarding the potential or likely normalization of an ISIS state, need to take account of this idea that this state operates with a different understanding of state sovereignty. So I'd also just like to make one small comment here about the economy question. As most of you know, ISIS has been self-funded since 2005, which makes it also, again, quite different from other extremist groups who have tended to rely on donations and fundraising, so that might be something to throw into the mix as well. Okay, so in conclusion, what I really like about using sovereignty as a conceptual lens is that it gets us out of what I described earlier as this kind of dead end of the artificial borders paradigm, because for me, the artificial borders paradigm, it's a yes or no question. Are these borders artificial? Yes. Okay, so what? So then you're stuck proving whether this matters. That for me is a fairly analytical dead end. I think we can acknowledge it and then turn to other more interesting questions. Sovereignty for me is more interesting because it allows us to ask a how question. How do various elements of sovereignty operate when we break it down, disaggregate it as a conceptual category? How do they operate conceptually? How do they operate on the ground in the states of the Levant? How do these elements individually and collectively contribute either to political transformation, political stasis, or political regression in these states? I tell my students that we only get the answers to the questions that we ask, and if we're not getting unproductive answers, then we should probably think about whether we're asking productive questions. And so I had titled this talk, Rethinking Sovereignty Through a Levantine Lens, but what I would actually suggest in closing that we consider doing is to take sovereignty from an inert to an active category of analysis and work on rethinking the Levant through a sovereignty lens. So thank you very much.